Hey guys, it's Chris from Highline Guitars and you're watching another episode From the Luthier's Workbench. In this episode, I'm going to share with you a technique that I have developed which will yield a gorgeous hand-rubbed oil finish, but without actually using oil. Now, as I've mentioned in the past, I love oil finishes, tongue oil, boiled linseed oil. They make wood look really fantastic. They're easy to apply. And they offer a moderate amount of protection to the wood that you use in your guitar. However, oil finishes can take forever to cure. And when you're in a hurry, an oil finish is not necessarily going to be the best approach. But since it looks so good, there has to be another way. Well, there is. In fact, there's a couple of different techniques that you can use. And in this video, I'm going to explain one of those techniques. And this technique is going to make use of Solarez I Can't Believe It's Not Lacquer, which will be applied a lot like a typical oil finish. It's going to be rubbed on, cured, and then buffed up to a nice semi-gloss to satin sheen. So let's jump in and get started. So what exactly is Solarez I Can't Believe It's Not Lacquer? Well, I'm going to put a link in the description below, and you can go to their website and read up on exactly what this product is and why it works so amazing for a guitar finish. The first step is to sand the surface of the wood as smooth as possible, and I'll start out with my random orbital sander and a 80 grit sanding disc. And once I have completely sanded the surface with the 80 grit, I'll switch to 100 grit, then 120, 150, and I'll finish with 220 grit. The trick to getting a good surface finish with the random orbital sander is to let the weight of the sander do the work, and then don't move the sander too quickly back and forth across the surface. If you apply too much downward force or move the sander too rapidly across the surface, you can end up with these really weird curlicue scratches that can be a pain to get rid of. I'm using a 5-inch diameter random orbital sander, and I've got it hooked up to my dust collection system. And I also wear hearing protection because this thing can get really noisy, as well as a dust mask. With a 5-inch diameter random orbital sander, I can angle the sander to tackle the bevels. I can also get into some of the tighter areas around the horn. However, its bulk does limit where I can reach with the sander. And if you can get a hold of something smaller like a 3.5-inch sander, you'll find it's easier to get into some of those tighter fitting spaces. Otherwise, you'll have to use a hand sanding technique to get into some of those tighter fitting spots. Now, as I mentioned a moment ago, I'm going to work from 80 grit all the way up to 220, and it's really important to use every grit in between. So I'll be going from 80 grit to 100, then from 100 to 120, then up to 150, and then I'll finish with the 220. And it's really important to use all those different grits, because if you don't, you run the risk of leaving some pretty noticeable sanding scratches in the surface. And unfortunately, it can be really hard to see those scratches until you start to apply the finish, and then all of a sudden they jump out at you. And of course, as I mentioned, I have to do quite a bit of hand sanding to get into some of the tighter spots. And what I'll do is I'll wrap the sandpaper around. You can use wooden dowels, you can use PVC pipe. In this case, I'm using one of the rubber spindles from my oscillating spindle sander. And of course, as with the random orbital sander, I'm going to work my way up through the grits from 80 all the way up to 220. And then what I like to do is one final hand sanding with 400 grit sandpaper. And here I've wrapped it around a great big pink rubber eraser that I found at my local dollar store. And this just ensures that I get the entire surface uniformly sanded to 400 grit, which seems to be a really good level to sand to just prior to applying the finish. And then periodically during the sanding process, I like to hold the guitar up to a bright light and look at it at a low angle to see if there are any surface flaws or abnormalities that need to be addressed. And then once I have finished sanding, I'll wipe the surface down with a clean cloth that's been dampened with denatured alcohol. And this does two things. Number one, it cleans the surface, and then number two, it allows me to see the result of my sanding process as if I was applying finish. So if there's any flaws that need to be addressed, I'll see them now and I can take care of them before I start to apply my Solarez. To apply the Solarez, I can't believe it's not lacquer. I'm just going to dip a clean cloth into the can, and then I'm going to wipe the stuff around as if it was an oil type finish like boiled linseed oil or tung oil. And I'm going to wipe a thin coat on, and I'll probably do like the top and the sides first, and I'll cure those. Then I'll do the back and cure that separately. It just makes the guitar a little bit easier to handle as I'm applying this finish. But I'll apply it and I'll let it soak in for about probably about 10 to 15 minutes. And because it's not been exposed to sunlight at this point, it's not going to start to cure. It's going to remain wet the entire time that it's out of direct UV sunlight. Once the Solarez has been allowed to soak into the wood for 10 to 15 minutes, I'll wipe the surface down with a clean paper towel. And the idea here is to remove as much excess Solarez as possible and then spread what's left into an extremely thin layer. It'll almost seem like I'm wiping all of the Solarez off the surface, but I'm not. I'm just spreading it into a very thin film. Then I'll take the guitar body outside and expose it to bright, unobstructed sunlight. It'll take about 60 seconds for each surface to fully cure. Then I can go back and do the back side of the guitar in the same way that I did the top and sides and expose those to sunlight. And once that's done, I have one coating of Solarez, I can't believe it's not lacquer, on the entire guitar body. Once the Solarez is cured, I can inspect the entire surface of the guitar body and look for any potential flaws that I may have overlooked prior to applying the Solarez. If I encounter any flaws in the wood as I did here along this back edge, I can just do a quick spot sanding, removing the finish and cleaning up the scratches that were left earlier on. And then I can proceed with just a spot reapplication of the Solarez, which I can then cure in the sun. When I've made any spot repairs and I'm satisfied with how that first coat looks and the Solarez has been cured completely in the sun, I can then proceed with applying a second coat. And to do that, I'm going to start out by lightly sanding the surface with a P800 grit sandpaper. And really what the goal here is to just simply remove any slightly rough spots that may be present in the surface. I'm not looking to spend too much time here. I just want to get the surface as smooth as possible because then when I apply that second coat, it's going to lay down really nice. The cool thing about using Solarez to mimic a hand-rubbed oil finish is that if I accidentally were to sand through into the raw wood underneath, it wouldn't make any difference because the second coat of Solarez will take care of that. The second coat of Solarez is applied exactly the same way as the first coat. I'll just wipe on a thin coating and I'll let it sit for 10 to 15 minutes, and then I'll wipe the surface down thoroughly to remove excess Solarez and then to spread what's left into a very thin film across the surface. So you need to think of applying Solarez as kind of like rinse and repeat. The second coat will be applied exactly the same way as the first, and then I'll take it out into the sun and let it cure. Now the length of time that you need to take it out in the sun is going to depend on how bright the sun is. In the middle of the summer on a cloudless day, it'll cure in a matter of a minute or so. On a cloudy day, it may take a couple of minutes longer. And once that second coat is cured, I'll bring it back inside and I'll lightly sand the surface with some P800 grit sandpaper. And the goal here is just to get rid of any rough spots or rag marks left from applying that second coat. Sanding with the P800 is going to leave the surface a little bit inconsistent looking and perhaps a little bit streaky. So a way to bring back a uniform and consistent finish with depth is to apply some paste wax. And the wax that I'm going to be using is HF Staples Crystal Clear, which is a pure carnauba wax. Carnauba wax is the hardest wax known to man, and this particular product is formulated with just the carnauba, no beeswax and no silicone. It's just dissolved in a naphtha-like solvent, and then once you apply it, you can let it sit for about 10 to 15 minutes until the solvent has evaporated out of the wax, and then you can buff it out with a clean cloth. And here I'm just buffing it out using a microfiber cloth that I picked up at the dollar store, and it works quite well. Of course, if you have a buffing machine, that works even better. I think the results speak for themselves. This looks like a gorgeous hand-rubbed Danish oil finish, but without the oil. It's just solar res and a little bit of carnauba wax. And best of all, it took a couple of hours from start to finish to apply it. And now I'm ready to continue on with the guitar's final assembly. Okay, well that's all the time I've got for this episode, and that is basically the technique that I used for applying Solar Res, I can't believe it's not lacquer, as a way to create a faux oil-based finish on a guitar body. And in next week's episode, I'm going to be doing the same thing to the neck and the fretboard that I'll be using on this guitar. So stay tuned for that, and I hope that you find this technique to be interesting, and if you learn something, please, by all means, click the like button and give me a thumbs up. Post your comments, keep them clean, I always check those, and be sure to hit subscribe if you don't already subscribe. Click the bell for notifications every time I post a new video, which is about once a week. And until the next episode, take care and we'll see you soon.